We're going to begin tonight with something that you will not hear about on other television networks. You know how I know that? Because I've worked at other television networks. That's right. As the only network news anchor who happens to be Hispanic, I've always wanted to share with viewers the story of U.S. interventions in Latin America. I think it's salient. Not because I want to be critical, but because it's important to understand how we got where we are when it comes to the problems that still plague this part of the world and us. The crime, the drugs, the corruption, and yes, the immigration issues that we now want to cure with a wall. Look, agree or disagree that these actions help cause these problems, fine. At least we should all know about what they are, right? What the United States has done in Latin America, right? It's important, it's newsworthy, noteworthy, especially when our news media now seems hell-bent these days on constantly sharing stories with us day in and day out about election meddling and about election interference. You want to know about election meddling? You want to know about election interference in a really grand scale? Stick around, folks, because here's the story that CNN never let me tell. In fact, they never even let me put this information in the book that I was asked to write. First of all, let's start with El Salvador. 1940s, the United States and Great Britain bankroll and control the coffee plantations there in El Salvador. When Salvadoran citizens elect politicians who try to take back control of their resources, what do? We send in the Navy and essentially crush them. In 1960, some guy named Fabio Castillo, installed by the U.S., actually goes to the U.S. Congress and he thanks us for facilitating a coup that gave him power over an elected president. And all that was before the Salvadoran death squads that most of you know about that killed 80,000 people in the 1980s. Now let's talk about Honduras. Going back to the 1920s and 30s again, the U.S. installs a dictator. The guy's name is Manuel Bonilla. He gives away most of the country's assets and resources to two companies, American Foods, now known as the Dole Food Company, and United Fruit Company. You know about them. They're now known as the Chiquita brand or the Chiquita banana brand. U.S. companies, with the help of the CIA, end up owning more than 1 million acres of this nation's absolute best lands, most of it not even paid for. They divvy up the rest with global companies, and by the 1980s and today, Honduras is one of the poorest and most dangerous countries in the world. Guatemala now, 1950s. The country elects a very popular guy. His name is Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz is this tall, blonde dude, right? He argues that Guatemalans should at least own part of their own lands, not all the American companies like American Fruit. So what he asks for is a fair distribution. When they hear about this, the CIA organizes a coup and removes this guy from office. Then, with the help of the U.S. Green Berets, they bribe military officials. They take over the radio stations, they distribute millions of anti-government leaflets, and replace Arbenz with a general who supports the United Fruit Company. The CIA's actions ignite a civil war that lasts 40 years in Guatemala and results in the deaths of more than 150,000 people. Let's talk about Chile. Chile, 1970s. After the democratic election of President Salvador Allende, President Nixon orders his removal by declaring an unofficial economic war. The CIA ignited a coup to remove Allende, and he was killed during that attack, some would say assassinated. The U.S. put in his place a military dictatorship led by a dude named General Augusto Pinochet. Not a good guy. With the support of the CIA, Pinochet is accused of killing more than 3,000 of his political opponents, 1,000 of which have never even been found. Let's do the Dominican Republic, shall we? 1960s. The U.S. sends in 42,000 troops to invade the country, which resulted in the deaths of more than 3,000 Dominicans. The United States, who had been interfering in the Santo Domingo elections since the 1900s, this time attacked some guy named Juan Bosch. Juan Bosch is a writer, an intellectual. He ran for president, and he won in what was described by most of the world press as a fair and free election. But the U.S. fears that this guy Bosch might be a little too friendly with Fidel Castro because they've been heard talking on the phone. So they send in the Marines to have him removed and replaced with 3 generals chosen by the CIA. You see, events like these that I'm describing now, it's happened in Panama, happened in Colombia, happened in Guyana, happened in Cuba, and in many other countries, and still have continued to occur. We're not saying this because we want to be hypercritical of our own country that we love. We say this because we think this is something we should know. Dan Kovalik is an attorney and a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. He's an expert, by the way, in Latin America, and his most recent book deals with U.S. intervention in foreign elections. Well, aren't you the perfect guest to have a discussion with about this? By the way, I don't know if you had a chance to hear what I just described, but that historical reference that I just gave on just 5 or 6 of the companies where the United States has very much intervened, very much meddled. Why do we need to know this? A lot of people would say, it's ancient history, Sanchez. Why are you talking about that? Why do we need to know this?
Well, you touched upon it earlier. We now see this migrant caravan that's coming to the United States, and a lot of people are pushing the panic button about that. These people are largely coming from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, 3 countries that you mentioned, that continue to feel the effects of brutal regimes and brutal wars that the U.S. sponsored in those countries. Meanwhile, I think it's important to point out that in October of this year, the Roman Catholic Church just canonized its latest saint, and that was Archbishop Oscar Romero.
Yeah, El Salvador.
Who was killed by U.S.-backed escwads in El Salvador. Meanwhile, the crescendo, really, of the Salvadoran Civil War, which claimed about 75,000 lives, and again, which the U.S. was greatly responsible for, the crescendo of it was the murder of 6 Jesuit priests and their maid and her daughter in 1989, again, by U.S.-backed forces. The U.S. has not only been destroying democratic governments throughout Latin America, it has been killing Catholic priests and archbishops. You know, one country that's rarely mentioned is Colombia, which is the United States' closest ally in the hemisphere.
I didn't talk about there was a famous incident there, pardon me for interrupting you, but I was reading and I didn't include it because I would have been sitting there all day. The famous banana massacres that occurred in Colombia, followed by what has been going on for the past 30 or 40 years, right?
Well, absolutely, and we can go back to 1928 with the famous banana massacre, which is, you can read in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's book, 100 Years of Solitude. But even more recently, Chiquita Banana pled guilty to sponsoring paramilitary death squads in Colombia between 1997 and 2004, with $1.7 million in support and 3,000 Kalashnikov rifles, resulting in the murder of literally thousands of Colombians.
You know, I want to just point out to our viewers, by the way, we're not doing this simply because, well, you know, let's look back and, you know, criticize our own government. I love this country, but at the same time, it seems to me like the media, who was supposed to be a watchdog of our government, of our military, to kind of be a check and balance for what we do, today, if not for you and I having this discussion, nobody in America would even know that we've done these kinds of things, that we had a guy named John Foster Dulles who ran the CIA while his brother ran the United Fruit Company, and they were in cahoots going around making money on these countries, killing people with the help of the CIA. That's crazy.
Yes, and people in those countries, they don't forget. this past. And again, why is it also relevant? It's relevant because right now the U.S. is saying that it wants regime change in countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba because it says it supports democracy in those countries. Meanwhile, the U.S. supported decades of dictatorship in Nicaragua in the person of Anastasio Somoza and his children. They supported the dictator Batista in Cuba before he was overthrown by Fidel Castro.
We're down to, I
Yeah.
hate to say this, that we're down to about 30 seconds because you and I could talk about this forever, and I'm going to have you back.
Yes.
But does it bother you a little bit, as it does me, knowing this story that you know and I know, me maybe because I'm Hispanic and I come from a part of the world where we hear people talk about these things all the time, and not that Hispanics don't love the United States, but they just happen to know a little bit more about this truth. Does it bother you when you hear people talk about this Russia meddling thing, knowing that the grand scale of what we just spoke about that took place in Latin America?
Of course. I mean, because even if you accept all the Russiagate allegations is true, what are you talking about? Some internet trolls, maybe a hacking of a computer, right? When we talk about U.S. interventions, particularly in Latin America, we're talking about military overthrows of democratic presidents, installing military dictatorships, brutal regimes that have killed and disappeared hundreds of thousands of people.
Hey YouTube, thanks for checking out our channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. We have tons of content for you just like this. For more of RT America's one-of-a-kind news and analysis, be sure to subscribe and never stop questioning more.